Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawalahu ba'd. With this session, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to move on to the next 4 lines, bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala, of the poem. And that will be more specifically related to the science of ilm al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. And so we took the general virtues of knowledge. Now he's going to move us to something that is a bit more specific. Na'am.
قال الناظم رحمه الله: فاحرص على فهمك للقواعد جامعة المسائل الشوارد لترتقي في العلم خير مرتقى وتقتفي سبل الذي قد وفقا وهذه قواعد نظمتها من كتب أهل العلم قد حصلتها جزاهم المولى عظيم الأجر والعفو مع غفرانه والبر.
And so the Musannif rahimahullah ta'ala, the author, Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Nasir al-Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, he moves us on to the next points, which all relate to the importance of al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, these principles or these maxims in fiqh. So he says, فَحْرِصْ عَلَى فَهْمِكَ لِلْقَوَاعِدِ جَامِعَةِ الْمَسَائِلِ الشَّوَارِدِ. فَحْرِص, he says, be very keen to understand these principles. Fahriz, show a level of hirs, which is keenness and eagerness, and be ardent, desire, try your best to learn or to be very keen in learning these principles. Ala fahmik, in understanding. Remember what I said to you earlier, these principles, al-kull qad yastati' an yafhamha. Every person can memorize them. You know, some of them literally consist of 2 words, al-darar, yuzal. But you need to understand it so you can apply them correctly. So the problem with ilm al-Qawāʿid is not, the issue is not what? Is not in the memorization of it, is not the fact that you acquire this principle, it's that you understand it properly. You actually know ta'i ma ta'ni hadhihi al-ibarat, and that you are able to apply them soundly and correctly. So he says, فَحْرِصْ عَلَى فَهْمِكَ لِلْقَوَاعِدِ, that you be very keen and ardent and serious. You show a level of eagerness in understanding these qawa'id, these principles. Then he says, جامعة المسائل الشوارد, that it is جامعة, meaning for they gather. These principles they gather and combine and bring together al-masail, which are issues. And we know that these issues relate to rulings. Issues meaning masailul ahkam, rulings of Islamic jurisprudence. What is halal, what is haram, what is wajib, what is recommended, and so on. Right? These rulings that you find scattered in the books of fiqh, and he says, ash-shawaridi, meaning that they're scattered all over the place. So all over the place, meaning that there could be a mas'ala at the beginning of the books of fiqh, and then you find one that is similar to it right at the end of the books of fiqh. Here in this portion of the Nadhm, he emphasizes a number of things, and they all revolve around the essential nature of, deep understanding of these principles so that you can actually gain the benefit of the science. What is the benefit of the science? It's proper mastery of ilm al-fiqh. You master the science of fiqh. And so the 3 things that he mentioned here is, number 1, that you are very serious and you dedicate time and effort into learning these principles. Al-hirs ala al-fahm. We're going to talk about that inshallah ta'ala. The second thing that he points us to is the nature of what he authored this Manẓūmat around, and that is going to be around Qawāʿid. Remember, these are, in essence, this book is about universal principles of fiqh, Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. And so, the nature of what he authored his book around is Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. فَحْرِصْ عَلَى فَهْمِكَ لِلْقَوَاعِدِ, meaning this poem that consists of these Qawāʿid. And the last thing is that he informs us of the role of learning these Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah in your journey in mastering fiqh, which is that it organizes all of these scattered, all of these rulings that were all over the place. It brings them together in a structured and ordinary sort of manner whereby you know the principle and you know everything that is an offshoot of it, everything that connects to it, because you have a proper and a deep and a sound understanding of these principles. And so your outlook to fiqh varies to the next individual because your fiqh is structured. And because of that, your case is different. You can master fiqh if you follow this methodology. The first issue, which is al-hirsu ala al-fahm, is a nasiha that is very important. Al-hirs on its own, the Prophet ﷺ taught us in the hadith, which is considered what? The 3 principles to success. احرص على ما ينفعك واستعن بالله ولا تعجز. Number 1 thing that you have to do, my dear brothers and sisters, is focus on what benefits. And so for you, throughout your life, to be very keen and focused on what you benefit, what you are concerned with, is what benefits you, is the general key to success. And how much our lives go to, finding ourselves in conversations and discussions and thinking about things that, don't bring us to any success, not worldly one and in the hereafter. And so this hadith is a very important principle. The first thing that the Prophet ﷺ informed us is ihras ala ma yanfa'uk. Focus on, be keen and eager. Put all of your energy towards what benefits you. And the greatest thing that benefits you, as we've seen moments ago, is al-ilm, it's knowledge. Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala would say, طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ عِبَادَةً وَالْكَسَلُ عَنْهُ مَذْمُومٌ. What is the opposite of hirs? It's to be lazy, to be unconcerned, to be negligent, not to be heedless, to not really give it time, attention and focus. Shaykh al-Islam would say, seeking knowledge is an act of worship. Seeking knowledge is an act of worship. And so laziness in that journey and seeking knowledge is something that is dispraised. It's like, being lazy, getting up to pray and things like that. That is what? It's an indication of hypocrisy. And so here the author starts off with his first advice, which is be eager and keen in learning. What do we take away from this advice? We take away from this advice that the individual will not acquire the science if he's passive. Meaning that if he just wants to sit and not really give time and effort, truly understand, see how to apply it, go through the stages of learning, you're not going to see the benefits that he mentions here. You have to be dedicated. And so he encourages with the issue of dedication, putting effort and struggle and sacrifice so that you can gain the greatest tools of mastery of fiqh, which is understanding these universal maxims, al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. The author rahimahullah ta'ala says, لِلْقَوَاعِدِ. We already discussed the definition of al-Qawāʿid. But these Qawāʿid are very important. And that's why he says, احرص فاحرص على فهمك للقواعد. Be very keen and concerned in understanding these principles. I'm going to reduce this topic of, the benefits of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah to just because he's going to mention a few things, but a few things that stand out automatically as we think about the concept of principles. That number 1, you will be able to comprehend and categorize new rulings. So when you understand Qawāʿid, you understand the application that, for example, your teacher gave you. But you can also go on and apply them to new rulings, which was what we spoke about towards the end of the aspect that related to the theoretical study of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. One of the things that certainly stands out, which relates to the wisdom issue that he mentioned previously, is with those links that you form between different chapters, one of the things that you will be able to attain is the relationship that exists between the different branches of fiqh. How Kitab al-Salah connects to mu'amalat, how mu'amalat, transactions connect to ahwal al-shakhsiyya, issues to do with nikah and talaq, all the to jinayat. And so fiqh to you is not just random pieces of information, it's a structured building and structured house. And so your outlook to fiqh will differ greatly because you understand the relationship between the different branches of this science. The third benefit is, obviously, so we said the first one is comprehension. And so we conclude by saying that you can also do a form of ijtihad, which is referred to as al-ijtihad al-tanzili. And all of this you find in the books of the people of knowledge, which is deriving new rulings as a result of, your ability in this science and your mastery of this science. But the basis of the benefits of al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is what he mentions at the end here, جَامِعَةِ الْمَسَائِلِ الشَّوَارِدِ. That it organizes all of these scattered and rulings are all over the place. Imam al-Qarafi rahimahullah ta'ala would say, من ضبط الفقه بقواعده استغنى عن حفظ أكثر الجزئيات. What does this mean? He says that whoever masters من ضبط الفقه بقواعده through principles, that he suffices himself from memorizing all of these different rulings. What is the ruling of this? What's the ruling of that? You don't need to do that. Why? Because you know the principle that they all feed off. You know how it is. So it's like understanding where did all these apples come from. You know, it's an apple tree. يَسْهُلْ عَلَيْكَ الْأَمْرُ, right? It makes everything easier. You know the root of this. And so that is essentially the benefit that the author rahimahullah ta'ala mentions it. And so look here, he says, جَامِعَةِ الْمَسَائِلِ الشَّوَارِدِ. We're going to see examples of this inshallah ta'ala, but let's use it. Let's use the qa'idah of al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak, for example. Al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak, as we'll see inshallah ta'ala, applies to countless fiqh issues. You can use it in tahara, where, you know, if it's too difficult, or al-yaqeen, not mashaqqa, al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak. If you doubt that you had fallen into a level of impurity, that al-hadath, which is that your wudu was now void as a result of you having passed an impurity, then if the doubt is regarding the impurity, you maintain what? The certainty of keeping your wudu. The opposite can happen. You doubt whether you made wudu. You stick to the fact that you didn't have wudu. You can use it in salah. How many times does shaitan tell you, I may have passed wind and things like that, right? You use it there in understanding that, no, unless you're certain that you passed wind, you continue praying. You continue doing that all the way in mu'amalat. Two people have a dispute regarding a contract. One person says, no, I gave you the thing. The other person says, I didn't receive it. What is the basis? The basis is that the person didn't receive it. And so you'd say to him, no, since he's, we don't have proof that you actually gave it to him, the certainty is that he didn't receive his item. And so you need to give him his item. It applies everywhere. And so it makes fiqh very easy for you as a result of, all of these different cases that you are able to apply them to. Use the qa'idah of al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir, as we'll see shortly as well. You'll see that, it applies to each corner of fiqh. Difficulty, for example, you can experience difficulty whilst, in prayer. And, for example, you're traveling. The Sharia encourages what? Shortening and combining and things like that. The essence of it stems from the difficulty that the traveler endures. You can see it in fasting. That if a person is too difficult for him, he's sick or he's a traveler, he doesn't need to fast. Mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir. You see it in Hajj and Umrah. You aren't able to do certain things because of a sickness or other health issues. What do you replace those things that you can't do, for example? You replace them with a fidyah, right? You compensate for it by slaughtering. These are all applications of what? Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir. So the second you understand what the difficulty that Islam accepts is, khalas. You become a walking machine that's just giving what? Rulings left, right and center. Because of your ability to understand all of these principles. The author rahimahullah ta'ala moves on to the next benefit of this knowledge. And so he says, the first benefit we understood, right? Which is that it combines all of these scattered in pieces of information and all of the benefits that we take away from that. He then, rahimahullah ta'ala, moves on to and he says, فَتَرْتَقِي فِي الْعِلْمِ خَيْرَ مُرْتَقَى. That you ascend and you climb the ladder of knowledge to the greatest and the best of heights. You make it all the way up there, with the greatest of the giants of Islam. And so he says, وَتَقْتَفِي سُبُلَ الَّذِي قَدْ وُفِّقَ. And so with that, you follow the path that was left behind, the traces of that path that was left behind by those that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala gave tawfiq to, meaning granted them the ability to truly access this knowledge. They attained success in this realm of fiqh. This was their path. And so he says, number one, the first benefit in this line is that you'll ascend. You'll have a teacher that's teaching you fiqh, but he doesn't know Qawāʿid, but you do. You'll become your teacher's teacher at some point in time. That's how quickly you'll jump. It's a shortcut. It's a shortcut to mastery of fiqh. فَتَرْتَقِي فِي الْعِلْمِ خَيْرَ مُرْتَقَى. that you ascend to the highest level of fiqh. And so, what do we take away from this part or this bait? The benefits of mastering these principles. What do we learn from it? That the concept of mastering fiqh is not in blind memorization of rulings. When somebody grabs a matin fiqhi, a text in fiqh, and just memorizes it. That's not how you master fiqh. How do you master fiqh? By way of the principles of fiqh. Does that make sense? فَتَرْتَقِي فِي الْعِلْمِ خَيْرَ مُرْتَقَى. That's how you ascend in this realm of fiqh. By understanding the principles that govern this realm of fiqh. And so, what happens is, you master these principles and you ascend in knowledge. You follow those paths of those who attain success in this realm, so it's hoped that you'll attain success just like them. And with that, bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala, that success in understanding, bi'idhnillah, comes as well, success in practice. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to grant us all التوفيق. فترتقي في العلم خير مرتقى. Number one, to go back and re-examine this bait, there are two principles here that are being mentioned essentially. That learning anything by way of its principles is the way to mastering it. Memorizing isolated issues, you'll never get there. Fiqh, by definition, relates to a'mal al-mukallafin, to the actions of, the morally responsible people. And the actions of the mukallafin, la hasra laha, la nihayata laha. They're infinite. You and I, which is why, we're constantly looking for a ruling regarding, today this form of mu'amala came up. People are buying and selling with this in mind, this contract, this way of doing things on the internet, right? We're constantly dealing with new things that are changing. If you want to spend your whole life trying to figure out these individual isolated rulings of fiqh, you're never going to get there. You're never going to get there because life is too short to memorize all of these isolated issues. What is the path to memorizing fiqh? Not the path to mastering fiqh. He says here that it is by way of mastering its principles. And that's how you become a higher, strong student of knowledge. That's how you climb the ladder of knowledge where you eventually become a scholar and beyond. That's how the people of knowledge did so. And the second thing that he points out here is that this is the methodology of learning amongst the scholars that succeed in this realm. And so it's almost like saying this is the blueprint to success. This is the blueprint to success. To mention a few things that happens is, or to go through some of what the people of knowledge said regarding what the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala points out here is, the statement of Shaykh al-Islam, for example, comes to mind, where he says, Al-ilmu laysa bi kathrati liwaya. Knowledge is not by way of the abundance of narration. The fact that you're constantly saying this, that's not knowledge. Knowledge is what? وَلَكِنَّهُ نُورٌ يَقْذِفُهُ اللَّهُ فِي قُلُوبِ عِبَادِهِ أو في قلوب بعض عباده. That is a light that Allah Azza wa Jalla illuminates the heart of some of His slaves. Meaning, they take it back to that light, that source, that evidence, that proof, that knowledge that came to us from the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's true knowledge. And so true knowledge all goes back to one source, is how the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala is explaining this. Shatibi rahimahullah ta'ala would say, Al-alimu man yafhamu al-umura bi usuliha. A scholar is the individual that understands things by way of its roots, where it stems from. Okay? وَلَيْسَ مَنْ يَحْفَظُ الْفُرُوعَ فَقَطْ. And he is not the individual that memorizes those isolated issues alone. Meaning that if you spent your whole life memorizing isolated issues of fiqh, you would never become a what? You'd never become a scholar. You have to seek knowledge here by way of this methodology of seeking knowledge by way of the maxims and principles of any science, including fiqh. And so, memorizing isolated individual rulings of fiqh is important. And it's in part and parcel of fiqh. And it's the beginning of fiqh in reality. But you realize that without Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, you tend to struggle a lot. One of the reasons why you struggle is because new situations or new incidents are not mentioned in those big books. If you start a book right now in any madhab that was written hundreds of years ago, you'll realize that, there's variations between its application then and application today. And so it can sometimes be confusing. One of the things that will happen is you'll notice that there's a lot of contradictory rulings amongst the different madhahib and different scholars and this and that. If you understand these principles and their offshoots are black and white, and these are the realm of disputes, it makes navigating these conflicting moments. Because many people today will turn around and say, well, I don't understand why there's khilaf here and there's an agreement here. Because they don't understand the root of where the khilaf comes from and where the agreement comes from. And Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah helps us understand that to some degree. One of the things that happens as well is you start to understand the more complex issues of fiqh from the aspect of the fact that there is a root and a principle and a foundation that it goes back to, that then you are able to analyze it with deeper than the surface level because you can't understand it isolatedly. And so these are all benefits that happen as a result of studying fiqh through this framework. The last thing that I quickly want to point towards بإذن تبارك وتعالى is وَتَرْتَقِي فِي الْعِلْمِ خَيْرَ مُرْتَقَى, that you climb and you ascend in knowledge, the best of ascensions, and you reach the highest level of knowledge. The greatest scholars of Islam in fiqh and in other sciences were scholars that dedicated themselves, their lives, to studying principles. Look at, for example, the example of Abu Hanifa. Many people, they think this is an aib in his madhab, this is a flaw in his madhab, that Abu Hanifa was so focused on consistency. He always used to, and this is why Ahl al-Ra'i, right? They were referred to as Ahl al-Ra'i because they always used to ask about hypothetical scenarios that did not exist at their time. They talked about planes before, hundreds of years before planes were created, and all sorts of other fiqh issues. Why were they focused on those hypothetical scenarios? Because they wanted to apply these principles of consistency to those scenarios. The hypothetical scenarios were example, tamareen, to train their minds to applying these principles. And look how years later, at some point in history, 3/4 of the Muslim world was upon the Hanafi madhab. Meaning 3 in 4 Muslims would have been Hanafi. And 1/4 of the Muslim world was what? Was any other madhab. Because of how consistent and how practical this madhab became, that it became the cornerstone for Muslim empires for generations. And this undoubtedly is from the barakah of this Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala, who dedicated his life to creating that structure in understanding the religion by way of its qawāʿid. The first person that wrote about Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah was who? It's a Hanafi scholar. Why? Because there was that dedication in the works of Abu Hanifa and in the statements of Abu Hanifa that automatically stood out. One of the things that you see as well is the greatest of scholars in understanding in the Muslim Ummah is Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. And if you look through his works, you see he had a dedication to Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. So many masail he concludes by connecting it to a principle. And so almost like this genius mind didn't really waste all of his effort in trying to understand all of these individual issues of fiqh. He thought, let me connect them so that I can truly attain knowledge. And look at what he became. The second largest madhab the world has ever seen. And all of his status that he has and merits in the deen of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Another systemic approach in deriving at rulings. You have, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam al-Khalafi and his Kitab al-Furuq. We need to spend a bit more time. Many of the brothers maybe have not heard of him before. We need to take out some time to understand his life. But the next person I want to focus on is Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn Taymiyyah was an individual that was so robust, gave so much dedication to principles that you see it everywhere in his works. If you have no love for the science of principles, it's almost like don't even bother read his works because everything about him is principled. He took principles to a whole new level. He's arguing with somebody and saying, look, you've opposed your principle. He's almost like he's a walking person that's just pointing out to his opponents, you've contradicted yourself. The principle was that you're walking on. And that's how good he was. He was so good at spotting it. And this is because his mind was almost trained to understand things in a principled manner. And because of that, look at the heights of knowledge that he reached. And so look, this statement is it's not just somebody, a scholar just boasting about the science that he's writing about. This is true stuff. There are stories to back up. فَتَرْتَقِي فِي الْعِلْمِ خَيْرَ مُرْتَقَى. That if you as well study the science in this manner, wallah, you will ascend, just like they ascended. And obviously other things that led to their ascension, but their dedication to Qawāʿid was a huge part of that. In their journey to mastering sciences and mastering the science of fiqh. And so these scholars are living examples for that statement. We're going to move on to the following bait, where the author rahimahullah ta'ala, or the last thing that I would probably highlight here would be وَتَقْتَفِي سُبْلَ الَّذِي قَدْ وُفِّقَ. تَقْتَفِي سُبُل. You have to follow the methodology of the scholars. Blueprint, remember that. We're not going to go too much time into that, but remember the blueprint. There's a blueprint out there of seeking knowledge, where if you follow, you'll attain knowledge quickly and easily. And wallah, if you start doing whatever you want, you'll tat'ab, you'll become so tired and you'll find like you're not achieving anything. Life will go by and by and by, and you're just trying to gather some sort of knowledge, you're not gaining it. So you have to learn this blueprint. It's going to make, for you to take out time to learn this blueprint, is far more beneficial than just continue doing whatever you want, so that you can actually acquire that knowledge. So even at subul, emphasize. And it's very important. Unfortunately, I don't really have too much time to dedicate to that. Then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, قَدْ وُفِّقَا. And that is regarding the tawfiq of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. The tawfiq of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is what allows us to attain success. As Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala says, على لسان النبي, وَمَا تَوْفِيقِي إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. That true success, my success is only in the hands of Allah. So yes, you can follow this blueprint, but it's also connected to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala granting you tawfiq. So ask Allah Azza wa Jal to open up this science to you as well. Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala was once asked, the giant of knowledge, Imam Dar al-Hijrah, the great Imam of the city that the Prophet ﷺ migrated to, which was the fountain of knowledge. Everywhere you go, there was knowledge. And he became the leader of that. He rose above anybody else in his time, to the extent that he was known as Najm al-Ulama. If the scholars are walking on the earth, this guy's a star. Yeah? And so he was asked one day, كيف حصلت على هذا العلم? How did you acquire this knowledge? And so he would say, ليس بكثرة الرواية ولكن بتوفيق الله. It wasn't due to the amount of narrations that I have. So if you were to go and look at some of the other people of knowledge of his time, you'll probably find people that have more narrations than him. But he said it's because of the tawfiq of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And so, just to conclude this point, be diligent and strive and put effort, but at the end of the day, it's in the hands of Allah. And so, don't forget to ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala sincerely, supplicate to Him so that you can actually acquire this knowledge. He's the one that facilitates it for whosoever He wants from His slaves. This portion of the Nadhm has some really important aspects to it. We'll just move on to the next portion, inshaAllah ta'ala. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَهَذِهِ قَوَاعِدٌ نَظَمْتُهَا مِنْ كُتْبِ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ قَدْ حَصَّلْتُهَا جَزَاهُمُ الْمَوْلَى عَظِيمَ الْأَجْرِ وَالْعَفْوَ مَعْ غُفْرَانِهِ وَالْبِرِّ. وَهَذِهِ قَوَاعِدٌ. That these are principles. Remember, we spoke about what these principles are. I'm just going to put it out there right now. There is some level of complication with regards to the nature of some of these principles. And we'll talk about that as we go through, inshaAllah ta'ala. Because like I said, ilm al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is a knowledge that developed and developed and developed. Up until today, with academic studies and things like that, it becomes more clear and more clearly defined than maybe at any point before in history. And so there are some times where you find qawa'id that are kind of squeezed in the midst of that are not necessarily qawa'id al-fiqhiyyah in nature. So they do include other qawa'id, namely qawa'id maqasidiyya and qawa'id usuliyya. But We refer to them as Qawāʿid mushtaraka, meaning that they can have a fiqhi application as well. So there is a level of complexity with regards to some of these principles, which will be pointed out inshaAllah ta'ala. But he says that these are principles that exist and were there and they're established. وَهَذِهِ قَوَاعِدٌ نَظَمْتُهَا, that these principles are there. But what was his role? نَظَمْتُهَا. That he's saying my role, meaning Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Nasir al-Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, that he made nazam of it. And nazam in essence is at-tartib. At-tartib, which is why poems, poems which are referred to as a nazam, Manẓūmat, they follow a certain rhythm, certain structure. Right? Poems. Nazam, meaning structure, and so on, but a poem follows that. And so here there is a wordplay, meaning that I've structured these principles for you, but he's also placed them in a poem. And so they're quite important as well. The way he covers them is really beautiful. And so he follows a certain structure, as we'll see, bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. And then he points out that these are not from his invention. He didn't come up with it. It has a source. And so he says, min kutbi ahli al-ilmi qad hassaltuha. That from the books of the people of knowledge, I gathered them. Remember the tashdeed here. Hassala. Not hasala. So he didn't stumble across them. It was just, I was reading a book and I came across this Qa'ida. He went out of his way to look for the most important principles that will help you in your journey of knowledge. And so he gathered from the works of the people of knowledge, these very important principles that he wanted to mention in this poem. We take away from here, two very important lessons. Number one, that true knowledge is taken from the scholars who preceded us. Abdul Rahman Nasir al-Sa'di is a scholar. He's saying, I didn't come up with this. This is something that the people of knowledge before me would mention in their books. I just simply gathered them and turned them into a beautiful poem that the beginner student of knowledge can study and enjoy and open up this realm of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah for. And the second principle as well is to honor knowledge and the people of knowledge. And so Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala commanded us to turn back to the people of knowledge because they are warathatul ulama. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of remembrance. So they are the scholars of Islam if you do not know. And the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us time and time again to refer back to them. To the extent that the early generations of Muslims would strongly warn against certain practices. Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala would famously say, إِيَّاكَ أَن تَتَكَلَّمَ فِي مَسْأَلَةٍ لَيْسَ لَكَ فِيهَا إِمَامٌ. That be aware of speaking about an issue that you have no scholar that preceded you in. Because that's how the evil and misguidance are opened up in this ummah. You waking up one day and saying, تَسْتَحْسِنُ رَأْيًا. You think that, this new idea that you've had in your mind, this is a very beautiful thought, and then you open the doors of bid'ah upon the ummah. Don't say anything without a scholar that preceded you. And so look how this great Imam, Abdul Rahman Nasir al-Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, exemplified it. He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, Shaykh al-Islam, من كان أعلم بالسلف كان أعلم وأحكم في الدين. That whoever has more knowledge regarding what the early generations of Muslims were upon, then he has a greater degree of knowledge and a more firm grasp of the reality of this religion. And so showing again that we have to have this issue of precedence. The scholars that preceded you in what you're saying. Today, you might be looking through an ayah and thinking, I can understand this ayah in this sense. Don't jump to, putting that out. Ask yourself, did a alim mu'tabar, a qualified scholar, precede you in understanding? So even here, the Nazim is teaching us a very important lesson. He's saying, yes, I gathered these things, but I gathered them from somewhere. There's precedence for what I did. And here as well, we see the importance of honoring the people of knowledge and that we ascribe the knowledge that we attain and we derive to them. To the extent that many of the scholars of Islam, they have a very great statement that was well spread in the books of the etiquettes of seeking knowledge, which is من بركة العلم عزو كل قول إلى قائله. That from the blessings of knowledge, you want your knowledge to be blessed. you want it to have fruit and to bear fruit, and for it to benefit you and benefit other people, attribute that knowledge to where you got it from. Don't just go around and say, oh, this is my invention and so on, almost like trying to show yourself as this sort of like this pioneer. Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, look at his humbleness. This beautiful nadhm that over 70 years later we're gathered here studying and benefiting from, right? And yet he's not saying to anybody, I'm not, this is my nadhm and boasting about it. He's saying, like, my job was simply the compiling, the ordinary, the structure, creating an order for it and putting it in a beautiful poem. Where is this, the essence of this knowledge? It can be found in the works of fiqh. Is that clear? This then leads us on to the next point where he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, and with this he concludes his introduction. And he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, جزاهم المولى عظيم الأجر والعفو مع غفرانه والبر. He says that may al-Mawla, the master and the controller of all things, and he is Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. نعم المولى ونعم النصير subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says that may Allah grant them عظيم الأجر, great reward, a tremendous reward, right? Much reward for what they did. Who's he making dua for? He's making dua for those scholars. And so he says, وَالْعَفْوَ, and forgiveness. And may he pardon them, subhanahu wa ta'ala. مَعْ غُفْرَانِهِ, along with his forgiveness. وَالْبِرِّ, and his kindness, subhanahu wa ta'ala. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, concludes this section of his nadhm with a mark of gratitude and humility to Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, which is this tremendous dua, this supplication that he makes for the scholars of Islam. And so this goes to show you, and is a strong indication of the level of humbleness that this man possessed, rahimahullah ta'ala. But he's saying his job is just simply that he turned it into a poem. This knowledge was derived from the works of the people of knowledge, and then he proceeds to make dua for them. Not even for himself, saying, make dua for me, the miskeen who authored this poem. Saying, look at the scholars that wrote this in their books. I'm just gathered them. Look how humble he is with his knowledge. And so this is a great sign of that humility. And look at the thamara that came from that. The benefit that came from this. Making dua for those believers that preceded you, family and others, is a great sign. And something that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala greatly encourages the believers with. وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ. But those who came after them supplicate for those that came before. And this is from the things that believers do for Ahl Islam. And so even when you're sitting and you hear radiyallahu anhum for the Sahaba, make sure that has meaning. When you say rahimahullah, or when you see a scholar's name, say that with meaning. We've kind of reached a point now where we say that out of habit and normality. Whereas, look at this scholar. He's actually, going out his way to make a dua that he actually feels. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them a great reward. وَالْعَفْوَ مَعْ غُفْرَانِهِ وَالْبِرِّ. Pardon them for their shortcomings, forgive them, and be kind towards them, subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was the long practice of the early generations of Muslims. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, from his tarjama was that he would frequently make dua for Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. And he would say, and this was after Shafi'i's passing. Shafi'i died early to 215 roughly. And Imam Ahmad died 241. 241. So he lived after about almost 30 years. And during this time, he used to make dua for him in sujood and in his night prayers and so on. And he would say, كان الشافعي كالشمس للناس. Shafi'i, remembering the life of this, contemporary that he'd experienced 30 years on. Shafi'i was like a son for the people. Great man. He benefited the people so much. He deserving of me making dua for him. Rahimahumullah ta'ala. Ibn Rajab, rahimahullah ta'ala, tells us an etiquette from the etiquettes of the student of knowledge and the Muslims in general towards the ulama. And that comes in the hadith. It comes in the hadith that everything that is in the earth, the al-barr wal-bahr, حتى الحيتان في الماء. The Prophet ﷺ said all the way till the animals in the sea, right? يستغفرون, that they supplicate and seek forgiveness for معلم الناس الخير, for the one who teaches the people good. Ibn Rajab rahimahullah ta'ala, when he's talking about the rights of the scholars upon us, he concludes with this point regarding that hadith, and he says, جزاء العلماء الدعاء لهم لا انتقاصهم. That the right of the scholars upon us and their reward of us is that we supplicate for them, not that we insult them. And so from the things that we always have to remember is these scholars benefited us greatly. Animals, ba'im, are seeking forgiveness for al-ulama and those people who teach people good. You, ma indak aql, to the extent that you can show a level of, courtesy towards those people that taught us good, you can ask them for forgiveness. Al-baha'im yastaghfirun. Antla, that is not befitting. So we have to do that, and this is the right of the people of knowledge upon us. And with that, he concludes this portion of the poem. To summarize, knowledge inherited, not invented. There's a precedence for honoring the people of knowledge as a part of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and acknowledging their efforts is very important, and it is what leads to barakah in your knowledge, blessings in your knowledge, and that dua, supplicating to the people of knowledge, especially from somebody like Abdurrahman Nasir al-Sa'di rahimahullah, the author of this nadhm, he's marked for his level of sincerity and humility. He could have said, make dua for me. I went out my way to make this nadhm. He didn't. He remembered al-ulama as-sabiqeen rahimahumullah ta'ala. And so this is a great legacy that he has left behind. And we're going to move on to the next portion.
أحسن الله إليكم. ثم قال رحمه الله: والنية شرط لسائر العمل بها الصلاح والفساد للعمل.
نعم.
الدين مبني على المصالح.
We'll stop with this one. So bait number 11. النية شرط لسائر العمل. النية شرط لسائر العمل. النية شرط. That actions, or often intentions, right? Niyyah, intentions, are shartun. Shartun, are a condition. What is a condition? A condition is something that, number one, precedes the action. Number two, that it is mandatory. It's a must that you come with. When you hear shart, this is important. If it's not there, then it's incomplete. He says, shartun lisa'iril amal, that it is the condition for all actions. And here, lisa'ir, he means li jami'il amal, for all actions. Then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, biha as-salahu, that in that you find as-salah, which is the correctness and the uprightness, the righteousness, the correctness, the validity of the action, or al-fasad, the corruption and the fact that it's invalid and it will not be accepted by Allah, lil amal, of the action. This is the first قاعدة كلية كبرى, which is قاعدة الأمور بمقاصدها. And the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that it is built upon is إنما الأعمال بالنيات. قاعدة الأمور بمقاصدها is the first of the 5 great principles of fiqh. The first of the 5 great principles of fiqh. Here, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he didn't phrase it like that. He phrased it in some of his other works as al-a'malu bin-niyyah, which is one of the wordings of the hadith. Al-a'malu bin-niyyah, which is that actions are determined by way of their intentions. By way of their intentions. We're going to stick to the nadhm, inshaAllah ta'ala, and just break that down just ever so slightly a bit more. An-niyyah is, in this context, does not mean sincerity to Allah. Sincerity, al-ikhlas, is wasfun lin-niyyah. The intention is anything, kullu ma qasadtahu, everything that you intended with the action. And so, what you have is intention. The term niyyah is broader than ikhlas. We spoke about some other examples moments ago, earlier today, about the intentions and what you mean by the actions, the meaning and what was in your heart at the moment that you had said that statement. That is why the fuqaha prefer the term al-maqasid, which is the meanings behind what you had said and did. The meanings behind what you had said and did. And niyyah, like I said, is broader than that. And al-ikhlas, sincerity to Allah, is an attribute from the attributes of intention, which is the attribute that needs to be found in acts of worship to Allah, that you do so sincerely for the sake of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. As for other actions, then it's not ikhlas. It's other things. It's whatever you intended by that action. And so when you're buying and selling and other such things, you don't need to be sincere. You just need to simply, what was the reason why you did what you did, and that is what determines the ruling. So it's the ultimate thing that was in your heart when you were doing the action. Does that make sense? So that is what the meaning of this qa'idah is. Does intention determine the state of all action, or is it specific to some actions? The people of knowledge exclude, and so here, remember what I said? He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, an-niyatu shartun li sa'ir al-amal. That intentions is the condition of all actions. Here, exclude one scenario. Exclude one scenario, which is what we refer to in the books of fiqh as at-turuq. At-turuq. And you always find that being pointed out as هذا على بنية الترك مثلا. That the intention behind doing that is just simply leave it off. And it has some very important and huge examples.
What's the exception?
Turuq, which is the things that you're trying to get rid of, in a sense. Things that you're trying to get rid of. And they have three very important scenarios, examples that the people of knowledge mention. Say, for example, an individual, he needs to pay nafaqah to his wife and children. That he intended nafaqah, is that a condition? Or just the fact that he spended is what was required? Spended. So this is one example. So he simply just needs to use that money for his family's sake, and that is bihada intahal amr. So intentions are not a condition there. Similarly, qadā'u dayn, right? Anytime that you are returning a debt that you took from somebody, that is also an exception. So you have this money, and you went and somebody owed me money, I went and gave some money to him. The fact that I did not intend to return a debt is not a condition. I simply just need to hand over that money, and with that, this debt has ended. And so that is also an exception. And the last is izalatun najasa. Izalatun najasa. To remove impurities from your body, from your clothing, from the area that you are praying. You don't need to intend removal of najasa for ibadah. These three and their like, we refer to them as at-turuq. They're simply things you're getting rid of. If anything is like that, you're getting rid of them, you don't need to have intention. And so when he says here, the intention is a condition for all actions, exclude this one scenario, which are the things that you need to just simply get rid of. They are not included in that.
What was the first question?
The first one in nafaqah, yeah. This is the finance that you need to spend, or the money that you're spending on your family. Just because you're giving that money, that's it. That's the only obligation that lies in. The specific intention that you have, it's good, it's better. You're rewarded for good intentions as you spend on your family. But the wajib is done. It doesn't mean that you need to go and redo it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And paying for bills, you just pay habitually. You don't have to
Yeah. So you're just paying your bills, for example. Yes, without an intention. These three and their likes, we refer to them as at-turuq. So these are almost like things you're getting rid of. That is the exception. Anything else requires an intention. This intention does a number of things. In the context of acts of worship, the author rahimahullah ta'ala says, again, jot this down as, in the context of acts of worship, al-ibadah, fi bab al-ibadat, it has an impact. And he says, بها الصلاح والفساد للعمل. بها الصلاح والفساد للعمل. That it has the ability to validate or invalidate an act. What is the act in this context? What is the act in this context? An act of worship. So the next amal, where he says at the end, النية شرط لسائر العمل. The actions are a condition for, or intentions are a condition for all actions. That is generic. It applies to all actions from the different parts of fiqh. The second you add on the validity and invalidity of actions, it is what? It's to do with ibadah. It's to do with acts of worship, because al-ibadat are the actions that have the ability to either be valid and invalid, and as a result of that, you gain reward from it, or you do not gain reward from it. In short, the first principle, النية شرط لسائر العمل, is the قاعدة كلية, is the generic principle, which is the same as الأمور بمقاصدها. The second principle of the second line, بها الصلاح والفساد للعمل, the scholars of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah tend to rephrase it as لا ثواب إلا بنية. لا ثواب إلا بنية. That there is no reward without intentions. And what does this mean? There is no reward without intentions? This is not generic. This is a ضابط fiqhi. It relates to bab al-ibadat alone. So it's specific to the chapter of acts of worship. Is that clear? Any questions regarding that?
ضوابط الفقهي هذا هو اللي هو second line you're saying?
Yeah, so it's that no longer is a generic principle. It only applies to
The acts of worship.
a quarter of fiqh, which is acts of worship. The first line applies to everything, as we'll see inshallah ta'ala. The second line does not apply to everything. There are a number of masail here that the people of knowledge mention. I want to basically skip through a lot of that, but they are important that we take out some time, inshallah ta'ala, to address a number of things that we'll go back to right now, which is the evidence of this principle. The famous hadith of Umar al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala an, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. That actions are determined by their intentions, and every single individual gets what they intended. So what you get are what you had intended. So al-umuru bimaqasidiha is a very important qa'idah, and a lot of things relate to it, as we'll see inshallah ta'ala once we get to the practical elements of it. The next thing I want to quickly cover is the status of this principle. The status of this principle is that it is the greatest principle ala al-itlaq. Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala famously said, هذا الحديث ثلث العلم ويدخل في 70 بابا من الفقه. This hadith, إنما الأعمال بالنيات, is a third of all knowledge. A third of all knowledge goes back to this hadith. Right? And it enters into over 70 chapters of fiqh. It enters into over 70 chapters of fiqh. What did he mean by it is a third of knowledge? This was further explained by some of the ai''mmah, the likes of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, where he said, this hadith is equivalent to a third of knowledge because it's from the three fundamental principles of Islam. So Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says, أصول الإسلام على ثلاثة أحاديث. The foundations of Islam revolve around three hadith. The first of hadith is إنما الأعمال بالنيات, which teaches us that there is no actions without intentions. The second hadith is من أحدث في أمرنا هذا ما ليس منه فهو رد. That first is regarding intentions. The second is regarding fellowship, mutaba'a. That you are not rewarded by making up whatever act of worship you want to do. You have to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The third hadith is what you should do when you are confused. You don't know how to go about things. What do you do? And so here, some of them, like Imam Ahmad places the hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir, which is al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat. That which is permissible is clear, that which is impermissible is clear, and between them there is this grey area. What do you do with that grey area? You avoid getting involved in it out of fear and falling into what is haram. And so these three hadith are the foundations of al-Islam. The first hadith teaches us that the foundation is intentions, the principle or the maximum of intentions. The second hadith teaches us the foundation of actions from a mutaba'a perspective, following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the third is what to do when we are doubtful and how to navigate that. And so these two statements of Imam Ahmad, or these two statements of Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad explain one another. Ibn Ishaq or Ishaq ibn Rahawayh rahimahullah ta'ala would say, no, it's not three hadith that Islam revolves around, it's actually four. And so he added on, إنما الأعمال بالنيات الحلال بين والحرام بين حديث الصادق المصدوق and من صنع في أمرنا شيئا ما ليس منه فهو رد. So he added on the issue of the divine decree of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala that is covered in the hadith إن خلق أحدكم يجمع في بطن أمه 120 يوما الحديث. So he says this hadith is a quarter of all fiqh. The point I'm trying to point out is the status that the early generations of Muslims gave this hadith. Some would say it's a third, some would say it's a quarter of all knowledge. The next issue is the concept of an-niyyah. What is the purpose behind it? What is intentions? Intentions, we look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is to separate normal actions from acts of worship. So this is referred to as at-tamyizu bayna al-ibadati wal-adat. The things that you do habitually, right? And an act of worship to Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. How do you separate between the two? How do you separate between you having a shower just because it's hot and you want to remove sweat from yourself, and between ghusl al-jumu'ah? What separates between them? Intentions. So this is the first issue. The next issue is the intention that separates between the different formats that this act of worship can take. So you have, now let's ignore the habitual forms of ghusl. Let's go to ghusl al-ibadah, ghusl al-ta'abbudi, the ghusl that is an act of worship. You can have a shower as a result of janaba. You can have a shower as a result of it being Yawm al-Jumu'ah. What separates between the two? Intention. And so this second one is tamyizul ibadat ba'diha an ba'd, separating between individual acts of worship. Then you have the highest level, which is differentiating between who you are doing this act of worship for. And this is where the element of ikhlas and shirk and riyā and these issues come into play. Being sincere in the actions that you're doing for Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala's sake. The evidences of that we'll just ignore. What is the ruling of niyyah? What is the ruling of a niyyah? The ruling of a niyyah is that it is wajib and that it is a condition for all actions. It has to be there, or else the act of worship becomes null and void. And this relates to this issue that came before. An-niyyatu shartun li sa'iril amal. Intentions are a condition for all actions, meaning that intention has to precede the action. Before you do an action, you have to have an intention behind doing it. From the examples of this qa'idah is that if an individual was to pray 2 rak'ats before Fajr, and his intention was, let's say, to pray Tahiyyat al-Masjid, then it would not be what? Sunnat al-Fajr. If his intention was to pray Sunnat al-Fajr, he didn't pray Fajr. So this niyyah, because of it being there, it identifies the action and it makes it acceptable as it being that particular action, not something else. But it needs to come before, and you can't switch around intentions throughout the day. If an individual was to fast the month of Ramadan by simply keeping away from food and drink from the morning all the way till the evening without intending to fast that day, has he fasted? No. He needs to come with an intention to having fast that day. So Because of that, you are able to identify that he is fasting as-sawm al-wajib, which is a day from the days of Ramadan. If an individual goes and donates some money to a poor person, did he pay his zakah? No, he needs to do what? He needs to intend zakah for that to be his zakah. And so he has to go back and redo paying that zakah. If the individual started off by, I don't know, kafaratul yameen, for example. He started to, I don't know, fast 3 days as a result of an oath that he was going to break in the future. Would that be sufficient? Because the action and the intention have to fall before. Everything that you're doing, the niyyah has to precede that. Like I said to you, the only thing that is not included in this is what comes under Babu at-Turuq. Babu at-Turuq. Some of the people of knowledge add on as well, and they quote an ijma' for one other issue that is not min at-tark, which is at-talaq. If an individual was to utter divorce and he did not intend it, then it would be a divorce as well. So the exceptions, everything is included in this qa'idah. The two things that are not included is turuq, which we covered, the things that you're getting rid of, and divorce. If somebody was to utter divorce, even if he didn't have an intention to divorce, it would be a divorce. And so Khalafi rahimahullah says, أجمعوا على أن صريح الطلاق لا يفتقر إلى نية. That the people of knowledge unanimously agreed that صريح الطلاق, which is the actual word talaq itself, does not require an intention. The next issue after that is the timing of intention, and the author rahimahullah ta'ala points us towards the fact that it needs to be before the act that you are doing, and the details of that we'll ignore as well, بإذن الله تبارك وتعالى. You have a number of masail that are very important for us to come to know, and this is why really studying this in detail is so important. Why this issue is so important is, from amongst that is, for example, you have the issue which is al-istishab al-niyyah, which is that the intention goes along with you. And what happens if your intention disappears? Like you are praying, for example, and you forgot about the intention of what you are praying. This is an issue that is discussed, and what happens. You have what's known as niyatul qata', which is the intention to break off an action. And what happens with that? So if somebody was fasting the month of Ramadan, he didn't eat, but he had the intention of breaking that fast. Is he still fasting? These are all things that you need to know so that you can truly exemplify this principle, and so that you have a proper understanding of how to apply it. From the masail that relate to it is the issue of at-taraddud. At-taraddud is when you have multiple intentions in your heart. Am I praying this? Am I praying that? So you start a prayer thinking, should I be praying dhuhr? Should I be praying asr? What happens with such a prayer? Or it has to be clear and defined. These are all things that can happen to us, right? And so we have to have the knowledge of that. I don't want to bore you with the details because this will all take time. We'll try and speed up, inshallah ta'ala. And other such issues. There is a mas'ala that's famous, which is known as mahallu an-niyyah, which is the place of the intention, and obviously that which all the scholars were upon, except for a certain view that is found in the Shafi'i madhab, and that even comes later than Imam Shafi'i and the leaders of the madhab himself, is that the intention, its place is the heart, and it should not be uttered essentially, except for things like Hajj and Umrah. The next issue that I quickly want to go through with this principle is the concept of la thawaba illa biniyah, which the author rahimahullah ta'ala described as saying, biha as-salahu wal-fasadu lil-amal. That validity and invalidity of an action is determined by way of the intention. The first aspects that relate to that is, number one, as-salah and al-fasad in this context is a ruling from al-ahkam al-wad'iyyah. Rulings that are to apply to us in this realm in the acceptance of these deeds, or we deem to be hopefully acceptance of these deeds in the hereafter. And so if you did this action properly with all of the aspects that relate to the aspect of the action, then we hope that you would get the reward for it in the hereafter because it was a valid action. If, however, the act of worship is what? Is not complete, then it's faulty, it's void, and you would hope that you did not get the reward for that in the hereafter. And this is what we refer to as fasad al-amal. And you need to redo the action as a result of that. So what does this action mean? This action means that if you intended the face of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala in an act of worship and you were to do so properly, then that action would be valid and you would have the reward of that with Allah. But there are multiple things that come into play with regards to this action. Number one is the intention of why you did it. And the act of worship, number one, need to be sincere to Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, as well as properly defining what act of worship you are doing. And so that is what this action of La thawaba illa biniyya means. We mentioned certain acts. You can bring any odd action if you want. Somebody went to Hajj and he was just with the Hujjaj. Intended no Hajj or anything like that. Does he get the reward of Hajj? These are the examples of it. So apply that to any issue in the books of Kitab al-Ibadat, the chapters that relate to acts of worship, and you would have a valid application. So let's take one that's a little bit more complex. If somebody needed to make ghusl from a janaba and wanted to make ghusl for Yawm al-Jum'ah, he needed to take a shower because of the sexual impurity, as well as the ghusl that is wajib upon him on a Friday. But he only intended one. Does he get the reward of the other? He does not get the reward of the other. But will these, so say for example, he intended the ghusl of Jumu'ah and he did not intend the ghusl to remove that impurity. Is that impurity gone? Intention, the reward we've said, La thawaba illa biniyya. The reward is not there. But is the ghusl valid in the sense where can he then pray?
Yes.
Yes. This is a point of contention. So the Hanafis would say, no, it remains in that realm of the two together would not work. He didn't intend the removal of ghusl of the impurity. And so they would, along with La thawaba illa biniyya, they would also say that fasad al-amal, because the impurity still remains because he didn't intend to remove it. Whereas other madhahib would differ with regards to that. Let's say, for example, forget about the second example. This is a bit more complex. It's similar to that one. We'll just ignore those issues. This qa'idat al-umuru bimaqasidiha has a range of applications and also sub-qawāʿid is probably the qa'idah that has the most sub-principles. The author only mentioned one or two here, which is the validity of actions and the reward that you sustain as a result of having a proper intention as you go through that action. We'll just go through it because of time constraints. Allah musta'an. Now.
أحسن الله إليكم. قال: الدين مبني على المصالح في جلبها والدرء للقبائح، فإن تزاحم عدد المصالح يقدم الأعلى من المصالح، وضده تزاحم المفاسد يرتكب الأدنى من المفاسد، ومن قواعد الشريعة التيسير في كل أمر نابه تعسير.
We'll stop here inshallah. So the next principle after this is الدين مبني على المصالح. الدين مبني على المصالح في جلبها والدرء للقبائح. So here he mentions a number of principles. A number of principles. I want to quite quickly point out that this principle is not in essence a qa'idah fiqhiyyah. It's not in essence a qa'idah fiqhiyyah, but rather it is an issue that relates to maqasid, which are the objectives of Islamic law. He says here that the religion is built upon mabni, and it's based on ala al-masalih. What are masalih? It's a noun for, it comes from, or the plural of al-maslaha. Al-maslaha, which is everything that is good and beneficial. That which is good for you is considered to be a maslaha. In Islamic terms, we refer to al-maslaha to be, and there's a range of opinions with regards to this, but equate between al-maslaha and two types of rulings. What? Number one, the mandoob, that which is recommended. Everything that Allah Azza wa Jal encourages us to do is beneficial and advantageous for you. Number two, every obligation. And so all of the obligations that have been obligated upon us, every single thing that has been recommended for us, these are all for our advantage. So what does the principle say? Ad-deenu mabniyun ala al-masalih. That the religion of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is founded upon and built upon al-maslaha, that which is beneficial and advantageous to the creation of Allah by way of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala having legislated this for them. Fi jalbiha, in bringing this about, al-jalb, which is bringing something forth, tahsil wal-jam', wad-dar'i lil-qaba'ihi, and also preventing falling into al-qaba'ihi, which is that which is filth and wrong. Here, the people of knowledge generically don't phrase it like that. The people of knowledge phrase this principle as ad-deenu mabniyun ala tahsil al-masalih wa takmiliha. That the religion of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is founded upon the bringing about of that which is beneficial. We understood what beneficial means in this context, and completing it. Completion here meaning is to gain the highest levels of that. And we're going to see that as it relates to the concept of at-tazahub. وَدَرْءِ الْمَفَاسِدِ وَتَقْلِيلِهَا, and repelling and reducing that which is harmful. And so the Sharia of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala repels and removes al-mafsada from us, or it reduces it. In short, the Sharia brings about, meaning it introduces that which is good for us, and it demands an increase in that. It removes and repels that which is harmful, and if it can't, it reduces that. This is what the religion of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is founded upon. The author now moves on to the next scenario. Okay? We've understood those two aspects. He says, فَإِن تَزَاحَمْ عَدَدُ الْمَصَالِحِ يُقَدَّمُ الْأَعْلَى مِنَ الْمَصَالِحِ. That if there are multiple things that are of maslahah, of advantages to us, beneficial to us, that if there are a group of them, عَدَدُ الْمَصَالِحِ, they're in multitude, يُقَدَّمْ, then you put forth. So say for example, there are multiple things that you can do in this specific time frame. Right now, ba'd Salat al-Isha, let's say, you can pray this, you can do that, you can read Quran, this and that. They're all right, recommended things, obligatory, whatever they are. What do? يُقَدَّمُ الْأَعْلَى مِنَ الْمَصَالِحِ. In that hierarchy of what is good for you, you pick out the highest of that. And we're going to talk about how we determine that. Refer to this principle as تزاحم المصالح. تزاحم المصالح. So if there is an overcrowding, or there is in essence a bulk of or a range of things that you can do, and the scenario of تزاحم المصالح has one condition, which is that you can only do one. So what do you do in this scenario? So it's a scenario is referred to as امتناع فعل إحدى المصلحتين. It's only possible for you to do one of those maslahas, and the only way you can do that is بترك الأخرى, whilst avoiding the other. The author says that the rule is يقدم الأعلى. You put forward the highest of them, the best of them. Then he says وضده تزاحم المفاسد. Say there's a range of muharramat that you may be pushed to do. Right?
What is تزاحم المصالح?
So the tazahum here, basically, if we're to break it down as simple as possible, is you can only do one thing of this range of good things. But there's a multitude of things that you can do. But they're all things that are either obligatory or recommended. What do you do?
This is the only, the principle itself is called as تزاحم المصالح.
No, I'll phrase the complete version. But let's just understand it first. This principle is referred to as تزاحم المصالح. The opposite of that is وضده تزاحم المفاسد. That there is a range of evil things, muharramat, that you are forced to do one of them.
The lesser of.
You do the one with the least evil connected to it. He says, يُرْتَكَبُ الْأَدْنَى مِنَ الْمَفَاسِدِ. That you fall into the ones that has the least harm associated with it. Now, before we even get there, I just want you to jot down the 3 levels that you have with regards to this principle. Izdiham al-masalih wal-mafasid, which is that you are forced to do one of 2 actions. We look at it from 3 different perspectives. The first perspective is if they're both 2 good things that you can do. Say right now, you can either pray your nafila, for example, or you pray your isha that you haven't prayed, for example. You say يُقَدَّمُ الْأَعْلَى مِنَ الْمَصَالِحِ. You pick the highest one in the pecking order, which is the obligation of Allah. You put that forward. That's simply what it means. So there you have a range of commandments, good, the encouraged or obligatory. You just simply pick the highest of them. The second scenario is you have a range of muharramat that you are forced to do. Somebody has a gun to your head. He says you have to do one of these 2 things. You picked the least of them in evil. You picked the least of them in evil. تزاحم المفاسد, he says, يقدم أدناها. You pick the least of them in evil. The third scenario is a bit more complex. It's when you have a combination of al-maslaha and mafsada. And that one we'll ignore because the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, did not mention. But the essence of that principle is دفع المفاسد مقدم على جلب المصالح. For you to avoid sin is better for you to incur some sort of reward. So if you are in a scenario where you're trying to escape a muharram, you put that before the doing something which incurs a reward. And that is the last scenario, and that has probably the most details associated with it. Ad-deenu mabniyun al-masalih. This whole religion is built upon that which is advantages to the individual. Now, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala filled this religion, as we said moments ago, with regards to the beginning of the abiyat. There's wisdom in everything. And that wisdom as well dictated that different things are encouraged at a different level because of how eager Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is for you to fulfill this thing or not. And so there's a pecking order. The wajibat of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala highest. You have the recommended act, and then you have things that are just, you have the option to leave or not to do, mubahat. On the opposite end, you have the makruhat, which are better off to leave off, but you can do if you feel like it. It's not forced, you're not forced to leave it off, but it's better for you not to do. And then you have the muharramat. You could quite literally replace every line in maslaha here with mandub or wajib. And every line you see mafsada here, replace it with muharram. Replace it with muharram. And then apply that to the different scenarios of what may come about. We'll just move on to the next principle. Like I said, in essence, this is not a Qawāʿid Fiqhiyyah. It's more a Qawāʿid Maqāsidiyya, but it has a lot of fiqhi examples that apply. So, for example, in essence, it's to do with maqasid, but it relates to applying that maqasid to individual fiqh cases. And so here, generally speaking, it applies to the preferences between a range of things. We'll move on to the next principle, inshallah. نعم المشقة تجلب التيسير.
ومن قواعد الشريعة التيسير في كل أمر نابه تعسير. وليس واجب بلا اقتدار ولا محرم مع اضطرار وكل محظور مع الضرورة بقدر ما تحتاجه الضرورة وترجع الأحكام لليقين فلا يزيل الشك لليقين والأصل في مياهنا الطهارة والأرض والثياب والحجارة.
We'll stop here inshallah ta'ala with the first lines number 15, 16 and 17. ومن قواعد الشريعة التيسير في كل أمر نابه تعسير. So the author rahimahullah ta'ala in these 3 lines points us towards one of the قواعد الكلية الكبرى, which is المشقة تجلب التيسير. That any difficulty, any hardship that you experience, the principle is that it brings about and it leads to some sort of ease. And he says في كل أمر, in every single matter, نابه, that you find within it تعسير, a level of difficulty is associated with it. The wording al-mashaqqa tajlibu al-taysir is the most common one that you find in the books of the people of knowledge. What is the meaning of this principle? The meaning of this principle is, if there is an additional, an excess layer, because all acts of worship have a level of difficulty associated with it. You'd rather sleep, but you have to overcome that difficulty to wake up for Fajr, right? Now, this doesn't deal with the natural mashaqqa associated with something. And so jot down al-mashaqqa al-asliyya غير مقصودة. So the essence of any difficulty that's associated with any action is not intended with this principle. What is intended with this principle? What is intended is al-mashaqqa al-tari'ah, an additional form of difficulty that is not normally associated with performing this action. So what you have is, you have the norm sort of difficulty of doing something, and then you have an additional level of doing something. For example, you need to make wudu with extreme cold that you feel you might get a sickness from and things like that. This is not normal. It only happens sporadically, maybe around a year, maybe once or twice even in some countries here and there. So this is an extreme level that doesn't happen normally. This is what we refer to as al-mashaqqa al-tari'ah. Number 2, that it's associated with some individuals, and as a result of that, other people may find it normal, but sometimes some individuals will find difficulty with that. And it's also limited to some time frames. What happens with this difficulty is Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala introduces al-rukhsa or al-takhfif. A-rukhsa is a concession. A concession is ma thabata ala khilaf al-asl, that which you do in opposition to the normative circumstance of doing something. And a takhfif is some sort of ease in how to perform the action. The evidences of this principle, this Qawāʿid al-Kulliyah al-Kubra, is a statement of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ, that Allah Azza wa Jalla wants ease for you and not difficulty. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, not place any difficulty in our religion for us. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. And all sorts of other hadith that comes with this meaning in this hadith, in this discussion. I want to go back to this topic of al-mashaqqa al-asliyya, al-mashaqqa al-tariya. Mashaqqa al-asliyya is reviewed as some of these people of knowledge as al-mashaqqa allati la tanfak al-ibadatu biha, meaning that you can't remove it from the action. It's always going to be there.
Example.
Huh?
Example.
An example that they mention is كمشقة الوضوء والغسل في شدة السبرات وكمشقة الصلاة في الحر والبرد. So the difficulty of the cold and things like that. مشقة تنفك العبادة عنها غالبا. You find some sort of difficulties that the action can be removed from. Now, so you have stages to this.
This is what Tari'ah?
No. Yeah, so let's go back to the issue of Salat al-Fajr. That's probably the best way to probably describe it. You have Salat al-Fajr, mean difficulty of just waking up. That is non-existent. You have the difficulty of certain time frames, like the cold. That we consider and we're going to talk about, which is associated with it. Because you can't do anything about the cold. Can we change the climate? No, it's always going to be there. Or the difficulty of مثلا praying in the heat, Salat al-Dhuhr. That's naturally associated with it. Then we have a level of difficulty that is even beyond that, which is not naturally associated with something entirely. Like for example, praying when the enemy is around. Okay? Now these are all stages with regards to this difficulty that exists and how then the Sharia then deals with that.
This comes under المشقة الأصلية ولا طارئة?
No, it's an offshoot of both. We're going to separate the two, don't we? But it's a combination of both. Al-Mashaqqa al-Asliya is quite literally the first two that I mentioned. The difficulty that is always going to be there, and the difficulty that comes in certain time frames. And then there's a difficulty that is not naturally associated with this worship at all. It comes from an outside influence. So the Sharia differentiates between, for example, the difficulty that comes as a result of battle and the difficulty that comes as a result of temperature. Okay? So, for example, wudu and salat, al-khawf and things like that, it has a whole different discussion to simple sort of cold and the influences of that. Now, generally speaking, the things that influence this difficulty come about as a result of a number of things that then lead to the ease that the Sharia introduces. From amongst them is travel. So there's a level of travel is associated with difficulty. The Prophet ﷺ said that safar is قطعة من العذاب. It's a portion of punishment. From that is sickness. And that you find so many ahkam where certain rules are alleviated as a result of the individual being sick. And we're going to see examples of that bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. From that, for example, is al-ikrah. That you are forced to do something. That is a difficulty that is not natural. From that is al-nisyan. The forgetfulness that is associated with some acts of worship. That also introduces a level of ease. And that probably has the least sort of examples. From that you find, for example, the fact that you forgot that you didn't pray a prayer. So for example, you had overslept Dhuhr as a result of traveling, for example. You entered the Muslims praying Asr and you prayed Asr with them. You've now lost out on what? The tartib in as-salah. The order of how you should be praying your 5 daily prayers. Do we go back and say to you, go back and pray both prayers, meaning pray your Dhuhr and then your Asr? Or do you simply just say, continue on as you did, because forgetfulness, al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir, introduces difficulty, that nisyan introduces ease. Nisyan is a valid excuse to avoid doing certain things, again, like in this scenario. But it has, like I said, the least possible examples. From that, for example, is ignorance. You did something out of ignorance, meaning then you are not held in the same level or to the same level of difficulty of the individual that did something amdan, out of him doing it intentionally. And the last is something becoming a generic difficulty, umum al-balwa. So something becoming difficult upon society as a whole, the Sharia introduces a level of ease in that scenario as well. The types of ease that is then introduced. So here, where we're looking at the Qawāʿid, you need to frame it out as the types of difficulty we consider and also the types of ease that may appear. We don't pick what is easy for us. The Sharia also already did so. So we have several types of ease. There are 7 of how the Sharia introduces this ease into our acts of worship, for example, and other such matters. This principle is generic, so it applies to anything outside of the acts of worship. From amongst that is takhfifu al-isqāt, meaning that certain things are not required from you entirely. Example of that include, remember, connect it to the types of difficulty that I mentioned moments ago. When you are traveling, you don't need to do what?
You don't need to pray for prayer.
No, so that's naqs. We're saying some things you don't need to do entirely. Fast. You don't need to do it entirely. You do it in other days. Do you need to pray Jum'ah? Do you need to do Jama'ah? All of these things are dropped from you entirely. Why? because of that difficulty of traveling. Does that make sense? So here, the way you need to apply this principle is the difficulty of travel introduces a level of ease of isqat, which is removal of something entirely, which is that the wujub of al-jama'ah disappears. The obligation of praying in congregation, the obligation of praying Jumu'ah disappears. The obligation of fasting on that specific day of Ramadan disappears. So here, always remember with this principle, look at it as an equation. Connect between 1 and 2. The scenario is a certain type of difficulty connected to a certain type of ease that you find in the evidences. The next scenario is what we refer to as takhfifu at-tanqis, which is a reduction in certain things. An example of that is what? Prayer. The prayer are reduced from 4 al-rubaiyat to 2 as a result of travel. We have what is referred to as takhfifu al-ibdal. Something is too difficult for you to handle. And so say for example, sickness, right? Al-marad is a valid excuse. That sickness or that you fear its occurrence introduces a change in how you can purify yourself for salah. What changed? Tayammum. You change the wudu to at-tayammum. We have what is referred to as takhfifu at-taqdeem, the ease of doing something beforehand. An example of that is what? Pray 2 prayers together in its first occasion as a result of, for example, al-matar, rain or travel or things like that. Does that make sense? You combine between them, but you pray them fi awwali waqtiha. The first time frame. The first time frame of that, the 2 prayers that you that you can combine. The dhuhr and the maghrib, for example. You can, for example, as a result of this again, it's a very rare scenario, but some of the fuqaha, they mention that you can pay zakah of 2 years before the second year of the hawl, the second year of the zakah comes in as a result of certain difficulties. And zakat in advance. And they discuss the reasons as to why that is. These are just examples I'm throwing out so you understand how this would work. The next is takhfif, what's it called? Takhfif al-ta'khir, which is the opposite of what I just mentioned. Is when you, for example, combine in the later salah time frame. Or such things like that. Ta'khir al-siyam al-wajib lil-marid. The fact that you have to delay the fast for the sick person so that he can recover during the days of Ramadan and so on. You have what is referred to as takhfif al-tarkhis. Tarkhis is when something that was prohibited is allowed for you. An example of that is?
Eating haram in case of in order to survive if you do not have food.
Which is?
If you do not have anything to eat,
yeah,
you can eat haram.
Ahsant. So to preserve your life, you can eat that which was muharram, that which was prohibited inda darura, during that difficulty. Or to prevent, for example, you've got something stuck in your throat. You can drink alcohol that's nearby you to avoid again dying and things like that. Al-ghassa and things like that. The last is what was referred to as takhfifu at-taghyir. The takhfif that comes by changing something. What do you think the example of that would be?
Changing something.
Huh? What does that change?
You can't go for jama'ah.
You can't go for jama'ah, but that is to do with isqat. That is getting rid of something. Maybe, what does jihad change for regards to prayers, for example?
Maybe maybe a woman who is breastfeeding changes, she can give instead of, because if she cannot make up her fast, give
no, all that would happen is ta'khir. She just delays fasting.
No, if she is not able to fast.
But because of breast milk?
Continuous, yes, maybe.
No, that wouldn't be a valid application. But taghyir, they bring, for example, taghyir hay'at as-salah, changing how you pray. Salat al-khawf. So Salat al-Khawf it changes in how you pray as a result of that fear. Again, the one thing I want you to understand quite quickly as we go through this is al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir is not just an endless scenario of you introducing whatever ease you want. There is a type of difficulty that Sharia examines that you then connect to a type of ease by way of evidences, and then you just multiply the applications of that throughout fiqh. That is what this principle of ease is about, that al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir, that it brings about and introduces ease. The next issue after that, inshallah ta'ala, is the sub-principles of this qa'idah. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned three. The first is وَلَيْسَ وَاجِبٌ بِالْاقْتِدَارِ وَلَيْسَ وَاجِبٌ بِالْاقْتِدَارِ.
This is the qa'idah.
Yeah, it's a sub-qa'idah of al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. وَلَيْسَ وَاجِبٌ بِالْاقْتِدَارِ. Or in the books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, you'd refer to it as لا واجب مع العجز. لا واجب مع العجز. That there is no obligation with incapability or being unable to do an action. What are some applications of this principle? We'll just focus on the evidences with regards to what relates to the qa'idah kulli. We'll just ignore the minor ones. What are some examples of that? Somebody is unable to stand for salah. What does he do? He sits. So the wajib of qiyam goes. What do we say there? La wajiba ma'al ajz. He's unable to do it. What is he supposed to do? Somebody's bald. Does he cut his hair for umrah and hajj? He's got nothing to care. Is he supposed to just wipe, the musa, on top of it? It wouldn't work. So because he's unable to, you just say, leave it off. Anything you're not capable of doing, you leave it off.
This is
Somebody doesn't have legs. Does he need to do wudu of his feet?
it's rukun, right, for the umrah.
Yes, it's a rukun, but he doesn't have hair. What's he gonna cut? Allah understand. Does the application make sense?
Does he have to do something?
No. Some of the Sahaba did so. Ibn Umar used to wipe the blade over, but even that, he never used to obligate it. He recommended it. Radiyallahu ta'ala. But if you don't have hair, what are you going to remove?
Just to fulfill the
Just do something else. This is an action that has a purpose behind it. So you have to meet the purpose. Just removal of hair. You're not just wiping. You're just removing. Yeah.
Yes. If he has few hairs.
Yeah. Another example is, for example, the individual that has certain limbs that are missing. Allah understand. You're really rushing me, man. I'm losing my. But somebody is missing limbs. What does he do? Can he do wudu of those limbs? You say yes, qut. That's it. There is no wajib upon him to do that either. And these are all the examples of this qa'idah. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, referred to it as what? وَلَيْسَ وَاجِبٌ بِالْاقْتِدَارِ. There is no wajib without ability. Okay? So, no obligation when you are unable to do that thing. If you are completely unable to do that thing, that's it. The obligation of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is lifted up from you entirely. You don't have to do that at all. What did we refer to earlier?
Sorry?
What did we refer to it from the types of takhfifat? It comes under takhfifu isqat. It's a form of removing difficulty, which is by removing that difficulty entirely. The action that the difficulty was associated with is taken away from you. Somebody is disabled to the extent that he cannot stand, pray sitting down. Okay? The next principle after that he mentions is وَلَا مُحَرَّمٌ مَعَ الطِّرَارِ. وَلَا مُحَرَّمٌ مَعَ الطِّرَارِ. The fuqaha, they generally quote this qa'idah as الضَّرُورَات تُبِيحُ الْمَحْظُورَات.
How do you determine which type of ease is?
Again, it's built on knowing, in essence, what the Sharia allows, and then exemplify that. Which is why I want to take a bit more time understanding these furuq. We're really out of time, okay, last time. I want to finish till light 23, but we need to take a bit more time to understand it. The way this principle of mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir, realistically, if you wanted to understand it, is you need to view it as a web and then an equation. So you have forms of difficulty, understand them. And then you have forms of ease and understand them, and you need to learn how to bridge between the two. Once you're able to learn to bridge between the two, you then go on to replicate that. Does that make sense? And that's how you continuously are able to derive furu' from this principle. Is that clear?
This is all the sub-principle, right?
Yes, these two are both sub-principles, yeah.
Somebody is not able to do the fight of the nafs. So is it a difficulty from outside or inside?
Which one? Which one?
Nafs, yeah.
Oh, a fight with his own...
Nafs, yeah.
No, so the fact that somebody is struggling with your own nafs is not something that is munfak an al-ibadah. That exists with everything. Your nafs is ammara bis-su. Allah Azza wa Jalla informed us that it pushes you to evil. There is shaitan. There is the fact that, ad-dunya huffat bi al-maladhat, or an-nar, and the things that lead to the hellfire, and the materialistic things. We find comfort in that. All of these things drive us to these things. Now, that fight is a fight that will always exist, and that exists with you as a human being up until you leave this world. Now, you don't give that a separate hukum. So that's ordinary forms of difficulty. So that has no discussion with regards to this realm. Okay?
We can say the Shaykh Dururat, Tubiq al-Mahdhurat is from the form of Takhfif al-Tarkhis.
Yes. That is takhfif at-tasqit, ahsant. The fact that something that was prohibited was made permissible. Something that was prohibited was made permissible. What are examples of that?
Same example, eating haram because
eating haram, yes, to save your life, for example, and things like that. Yeah.
For just because to save his life.
To ikrah. All of these things work for that scenario. Exactly. For example, eating al-mayta, right? Because you found nothing else to eat to save your life. To drink alcohol for that ghassa, when you're struggling to swallow something so that you can save your life. Right? All of these different things allow that which is muharram because of that difficulty. And if you look at it right now, al-darurat in this context is a heavy margin. You're saving life, and that's what the meaning of al-darura is. The author then moves on to mention another principle after that, which is وَكُلُّ مَحْذُورٍ مَعَ الضَّرُورَةِ وَكُلُّ مَحْذُورٍ مَعَ الضَّرُورَةِ بِقَدْرِ مَا تَحْتَاجُهُ الضَّرُورَةِ. Now, this qa'idah is, if you want to call it, an offshoot of an offshoot. So we've got al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That then leads to the second qa'idah that we have here, which is that al-darurat tubih al-mahdhurat. This principle is a sub-principle of al-darurat tubih al-mahdhurat. If you want to write down how it comes about. What is the name of this principle in the books of fiqh? They quote it as al-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadariha. Al-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadariha. The meaning of this is that any sort of ease that the Sharia allows for you in that moment of difficulty, you are only allowed to take from it to the degree that your difficulty requires. So for example, if you took a bottle of alcohol to swallow something to avoid death because something was stuck in your throat, you're not allowed to go and finish that bottle. Does that make sense? If you're eating mayta, for example, you don't go and eat, just eat biqadr al-haja, just enough to allow you to survive, and you leave it. Because the second you've saved yourself from al-halaka, that's it. Aadat hukm al-asl. The original ruling comes back in, which was that thing was prohibited. You're not allowed to take more than that. You are not allowed to take more than that. And with that, we conclude this portion of the thing. How many principles do we have in these 3 lines?
Which 3 lines?
These 3 lines, 15, 16, and 17.
First is al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, and then we have the sub-principles too after that, and then sub-principle, which is...
So 4 principles. Jot them down and memorize them with maybe like one example. 4 principles, probably memorize them with one example. We'll move on to the next one, inshallah ta'ala. Al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shakk. Yeah. And probably just finish off with one or how many minutes we have?
9:20.
9:20. Okay, خلاص. Yeah. Bismillah.
قال رحمه الله: وترجع الأحكام لليقين فلا يزيل الشك لليقين والأصل في مياهنا الطهارة والأرض والثياب والأرض والثياب والحجارة والأصل في الأبضاع واللحوم والنفس والأموال للمعصوم تحريمها حتى يجيء الحل فافهم هداك الله ما يمل والأصل في عاداتنا الإباحة حتى يجيء صارف الإباحة.
Don't worry about it. We'll leave al-aslu fi adatin al-ibaha to tomorrow. Let's just take principles 18 to 21, inshaAllah ta'ala. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, says, وَتَرْجِعُ الْأَحْكَامُ لِلْيَقِينِ فَلَا يُزِيلُ الشَّكُّ لِلْيَقِينِ وَتَرْجِعُ الْأَحْكَامُ لِلْيَقِينِ. The all rulings go back to that certainty, okay? That certain position. That which you knew for certain. We've spoken about this earlier, which is that which you knew was the case before this doubt appeared. The only real thing that I want to really emphasize with regards to this principle before we begin is that you have to, with this principle, you have to understand what is al-asl and what is al-tari. What was the default and what appeared. So the default was that which you knew for certain. If you knew for certain you had wudu, that's yaqeen, okay? If you knew for certain you did not have wudu, that was the yaqeen. And then whatever else that comes, you refer to that as a shak, that thing that later on appears. The principle states that أن اليقين لا يزول بالشك. The doubts do not remove that certainty. Just because you're doubtful of something, it does not impact that certainty. A number of things that relate to this principle. Number one, the condition of this principle, and as we said with all principles, Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah generally speaking is, and this, the reason why we're going to mention it more specifically is because it relates to a very important chapter in the books of fiqh, which is Kitab al-Ridda. They say, for example, that al-yaqeen huna is what we refer to as al-yaqeen al-talabi, lal-khabari. If somebody had certainty in the fact that the Prophet ﷺ was actually the Prophet and a messenger of Allah, but then as time went on, he grew to doubt it, would his Islam still be certain, or does it become compromised? And he leaves the fold of Islam, right? Why? Why does this rule not apply to that?
That's one of the conditions of Shahada.
One of the conditions of Shahada. Anything else?
This, he has to be certain about the beliefs, aqidah.
You have to be certain about beliefs. No, quite simply, the reason why this qa'idah does not apply to it is because this qa'idah applies to actions. It does not apply to beliefs. So remember what we said about fiqh, that it's about a'mal al-mukallafin. Aqeedah is not the discussion. And so remember, this is a very good example of why that clause was mentioned earlier. These Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah do not deal with aqeedah issues. Doubts do compromise your belief, but it does not compromise your actions. It does not compromise your actions. And so that is the difference. So you would say with regards to aqeedah, they would say ash-shakku yu'athiru fil yaqeen. That doubts do impact and affect fil yaqeen, in your certainty. Whereas in the books of fiqh, we don't include that. The reason why I want to mention that more specifically is with regards to Kitab al-Ridda and Bab al-Hudud, this principle does slightly vary. Because there are scenarios where al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shakk is not applied. Why? Because it goes back to aqeedah issue. Remember we said earlier about exceptions to this principle. The reason why an exception was made for Kitab al-Ridda in the books of fiqh was because in essence it does not go to an actionary based thing. It goes back to an aqeedah based discussion. The next thing that I want to quite quickly mention, so al-yaqeen huna is not just any odd certainty. it's something that you are truly convinced in, you have resolve regarding. They refer to it as al-i'tiqad al-jazim. Something that you are certain of, completely sure that this is the reality. This becomes the default position. Do you include al-dhann al-zahir in that as well? So that which you probably assume. So say for example, if you were doubtful that you had wudu, you thought most likely, what I remember, I had wudu, but you were doubting whether you had a hadith or you went to the toilet after that, you were doubtful in regards to that. Does the principle still apply?
What was the original state?
So the original state was not certainty.
No.
It was a strong assumption. I won't go too much into this issue, inshallah ta'ala, but I want you to understand this is also a point of discussion amongst the scholars of Islam so that you can apply this concept properly. Are assumptions included in this as well or not? Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, for example, would say, اعلم أنهم يطلقون العلم واليقين ويريدون بهما الظن الظاهر. So he says a strong assumption is like al-yaqeen. But do the scholars agree on that? No. And so it's a point of discussion as it relates to this issue. A shak in this concept, huh?
What is the stronger view in this?
Oh, we're not going into that. I'm just trying to throw in these things so we can get to understanding the principles just a little bit more. So that which is certain is clear-cut certainty. Anything else there's some debate regarding. A shak here is very important to us for understand as well. A shak is used in two contexts. A shak comes regarding that which you are 50-50 about. Meaning you don't or you don't know, you're completely bang right in the middle. That is referred to as a shak. Shak is also referred to as mutlaq al-taraddud. So anything that could have possibly have happened is also referred to as a shak. So it's the possibility in general. And the people of knowledge in this qa'idah mean the second one and not the first. And so anytime you are in doubt in any way, shape or form, it doesn't have to be completely 50-50 on it, is included in this principle. So these are the 2 points that I quickly want to mention quite quickly. And now we want to go to the evidence, inshallah ta'ala, of this qa'idah, and then we move on to the sub-qawāʿid, inshallah ta'ala. The first qa'idah, or the first evidence of this qa'idah, is the hadith of Abdullah ibn Zayd ibn Asim radiyallahu ta'ala an, regarding شُكِيَ إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الرجل يخيل إليه أنه يجد الشيء في صلاته, which is the hadith that comes regarding the passing of wind in prayer. So somebody thinks, يخيل إليه, he imagines that he's passed wind. What did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say to this individual? لا ينصرف حتى يسمع صوتا أو يجد ريحا أو يجد ريحا. Up until he's certain that he smelled or heard something, he does not leave. So what does this mean? This means that the simple imagination does not remove your impurity. So the Prophet ﷺ is laying the foundation that the fact that you assume that it happened does not remove the purity that came before that you were certain of and that you were praying on. And similarly, the people of knowledge mention an ijma' regarding the consensus of the ummah regarding this issue, which is also the evidence that establishes this principle. Now I want to move on to this next discussion, inshallah ta'ala, and this, like I said, has an endless sort of series of applications with regards to this. The next portion is that the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, mentions a number of sub-principles that enter under this general rule. He mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, 9 sub-principles, I believe. Any more? Yes, so 9. We're going to quite quickly mention them. And I think I've already run out of time, Allahu musta'an. He's going to say, al-aslu fi kada, al-aslu fi kada, al-aslu fi kada. This principle, for you to understand these next 9 sub-principles, does not just deal with your individual doubts. It also deals with other things you are doubtful regarding. So say, for example, there was water in this cup, and you had a doubt whether it was pure or impure. What is the default position? You see meat, for example, you were doubtful whether it's halal or haram. What was the default position? So it teaches us the default position of any and odd things, and that is what he's going to go through now. وترجع الأحكام لليقين فلا يزيل الشك لليقين. ترجع الأحكام, ruling go back to certainty. So certainty is what removes anything and what we base anything on. And this is a قاعدة as well, which is very important for us to know, which is ما ثبت بيقين لا يرتفع إلا بيقين. But we'll talk about that another time, which is, so here in reality, the first line you have two principles. ما ثبت بيقين لا يرتفع إلا بيقين. Because anything and everything, so even if your wudu had actually broken, what is it that proves your wudu is broken? The certainty of you knowing that your wudu is broken, not the doubt. And so doubts do not remove certainty. That's the first line, okay? Two principles there. The next principle after that is al-aslu fi miyahina al-tahara. Al-aslu fi miyahina al-tahara. That the basis for our water is that it is pure. That it is pure, meaning that you can use it for a tatahhur, for purification. Meaning that it's tahir, it's pure in and out of itself, and it purifies other things. Al-aslu fi miyahin al-tahara.
Do they call the sub-principle as well?
This is a sub-principle, yes.
Or do they call it in a different way?
No, it's a sub-principle. It's a sub-principle. Actually, you could consider it a dhabit fiqhi. You could, but even though al-aslu fi miyahin al-tahara applies to more than just one bab. And we'll see examples of that. More than one bab. Al-aslu fi miyahin al-tahara, if you see water lying around somewhere, you assume that it is what? Pure up until? You are sure that it is not pure. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, then says, wal-ard. That the asl of the earth is what? That it is? Pure, tahir as well. What is the proof for that? Hadith of?
When
جُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا. That the earth was made for me a place of prayer and pure. So the earth, all of it is pure up until you are certain that it's impure. If you go to the park right now and you miss salah, for example, you're scared, if by going looking for a masjid you missed the salah time would go out. You pray in the park. You don't say maybe somebody did this and somebody did that, or maybe an animal came and, left behind some sort of najasa. Unless you can physically see najasa, you pray. Does that make sense? Al-aslu fi miyahin al-tahara wal-ard. So we see the purity of water and we see the purity of land in general. Then the author says, وَالثِّيَابِ, which are clothing. Pieces of clothing are essentially pure, unless you have an evidence that it is impure, so you can get up and pray in them. Does that make sense? Any clothing that you find, you don't assume that there's some sort of najasa on it or whatever. You assume that it's tahir up until you know that there is impurity on it. That is the default position. The author then says, وَالْحِجَارَةِ. And hijara here, he's referring to, or what is he referring to?
stones for istijmar.
Stones for istijmar, that which you purify yourself with. And as well, anything else that you would remove that filth from your body from to purify yourself with. Because if that thing is not pure, it's not going to purify you. And so he's saying the asl is that it is tahir as well. Then he says, وَالْأَصْلُ فِي الْأَبْضَاعِ وَاللُّحُومِ وَالنَّفْسِ وَالْأَمْوَالِ لِلْمَعْصُومِ تَحْرِيمُهَا حَتَّى يَجِيءَ الْحِلُّ فَافْهَمْ هَدَاكَ اللَّهُ مَا يُمِلُّ. So, al-aslu fil abda' or ibda'. Al-ibda' is what? What is ibda'? What do you have in translations there? Complex. Al-ibda' بكسر الألف, ibda' is عقد nikah. So I think that's a mistranslation. But he's correct in meaning. So the author rahimahullah ta'ala says, al-aslu fil ibda', there's two words that are very similar to each other. Ibda' and abda'. If you put a kasra on it, it refers to the marital contract, aqd al-nikah. If you put a fatha on it, it refers to private parts, which is what is the process of what would happen with a scenario of intimacy, which is the placing of private parts into each other, right? Tadakhul al-furuj. So the author, what he actually meant here was wal aslu fil abda'i, that the essence or the basis, the default position of engaging in a sexual encounter. So it's abda' and it's not ibda', is that it is haram up until a marital contract makes it halal. And that is why he says at the end, تحريمها حتى يجيء الحل.
That is in the other.
Haram up until that which makes it halal comes about, which is by way of the marital contract. We're going to talk about that in 1 minute. So the sub principles that we have here is how many so far? Al-aslu fi al-miyah, al-aslu fi al-ard, al-aslu fi al-thiyab, al-aslu fi al-hijara, and then you have al-aslu fi al-abda'. Okay? Al-aslu fi al-abda' is where the haram starts. If you wanted to be very precise, then you can write al-aslu fi al-ibda' is al-hil. The default position of any aqd al-nikah is that it is allowed. You can perform aqd al-nikah with anybody, right? Any woman you choose to marry, it's allowed for you to marry. You need an evidence to say you can't marry that woman, right? Because she is one of those women that enters into those women that are haram for you to marry. Your muharramat, ayat al-muharramat, that you are not allowed to marry. Now that requires an evidence. But the default position of whoever you choose to marry is what? Allowed, halal. So if you wanted to be very precise here, you would say al-aslu fi al-ibda' is al-hil. And al-aslu fi al-abda' is al-tahrim. So it sounds very similar to each other, but they reflect two different realities. So the essence of marital contract is that it's all permissible up until an evidence is established to say that this marital contract is not allowed. And there has to be reasons for that. As for marital sexual relations with a woman, then it's all haram up until a marital contract appears. And so that is what these two principles mean. And again, the details of it you see in the books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah and the evidences of that. Are we clear so far with that? Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala says, فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. Marry whoever you want of women. Doesn't that show the permissibility of any marital contract? It does. As for وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ, matters like that all goes to show you that al-farj al-aslu fihi ماذا الحفظ, that you protect it and that you don't engage with any sort of relationships based on that. And so that has to be preserved. Al-aslu fil furuj al-tahrim. Al-aslu fil furuj al-tahrim. The next sub-principle that he mentions is what? Al-aslu fil luhum. And this is also a complicated one. What number is this? 6. So al-aslu fil ibda' and abda', we can make it both from number 5. Al-aslu fi al-luhum. Al-aslu fil luhum, it depends on what you mean again. So here the people of knowledge in the books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, they mention 2 scenarios. You've got what is known as jinsul luhum, which is the generic types of meat. So say for example, no, we didn't know what the ruling of horse meat was. Are you allowed to eat horse meat? Or donkey meat or mule meat?
But not the domestic one.
Not the domestic one. So you didn't know the essence of a ruling of a type of meat. Then all meat is halal in Islam up until an evidence is established. And so this is what is referred to as the principle of jinsul luhum, which is the generic type of meat. All meat are permissible up until the proof is established that certain types of meats are haram. Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala says, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا عَلَى طَاعِمٍ يَطْعَمُهُ إِلَّا أَن يَكُونَ مَيْتَةً أَوْ دَمًا مَسْفُوحًا أَوْ لَحْمَ خِنْزِيرٍ. certain types of meat that are haram, right? But all of the meat are all halal. Refer to this as jins al-lahm, which is the generic type of meat. All of it is halal up until you need to establish an evidence to say that this type of meat is haram.
Here,
I'll explain to you. What is he referring to this? Again, this is why I'm saying abda and luhum here are the tricky two. Luhum in this context, he's referring to ayn al-lahm. Ayn al-lahm is this individual meat. So you've got this meat right in front of you. This meat, which is from the types of meat which is halal. Does it become halal for you to eat? Are you allowed to eat any other meat? If you go into the souk right now, maybe not so much in a Muslim country, all over the Muslim country. I'll come from the UK. If you were to walk into a random restaurant and they're serving meat, are you allowed to eat the meat? Why not?
To define the type first.
Forget about the type. Let's say the type is halal.
The land takes precedence.
Forget about the land.
have bought it.
Forget about buying.
Yeah, it's not. There is halal.
Huh?
It's still
The asl is haram. The author said, al-aslu fil luhum al-tahrim. But I'm saying to you, what does this mean? The asl for individual meats, a plate of meat was put in front of you. He's saying the default position of that meat is that it's haram. Why?
Why?
What does meat require to become halal? Zakah. It needs to be slaughtered Islamically. So he's saying here, al-aslu fil luhumi at-tahrim. That the essence for individual meat that is placed in front of you is that it's haram. You're not allowed to consume it up until you make sure of what? Hatta yaji'a al-hillu. Up until that which makes it permissible comes about, or you understand and know for certain that it's halal, and you come to become aware that it was slaughtered Islamically. And so this is what he's referring to. The only meat you're allowed to eat is that which is slaughtered in the name of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Any other meat is haram. And so explain right there again, al-aslu fil luhum, you've got two scenarios. If what he means by luhum is individual meats, then it's haram. He's correct in that, because you need to make sure that it is being slaughtered Islamically. If what he means is the generic feature of all meat, then that is not correct, because all meat is halal up until the evidence is established that it is haram. And so there is a level of detail that goes into that as well. The next is al-aslu fi. What is the next one? Al-aslu fi nafs. What does he mean by that?
To kill a person. To kill a person.
To kill a person. So he says al-aslu fi an-nafs, which is ad-dam al-ma'soom, as he explained at the end, an-nafs wal-amwali lil-ma'soumi. What is an-nafs al-ma'soomah? An-nafs al-ma'soomah is a nafs that is protected under Islamic law. The life of somebody that is protected under Islamic law. Who is it protected under Islamic law? Everybody?
Except for those who commit, for example,
Except when something has been established.
he has done,
Yeah.
he has murdered somebody or ridda. These are the exceptions. Other than that, the other Muslims.
So it's that famous hadith regarding when people's lives become permissible in the Sharia. So here the Dam Ma'soom opposes the three qualities. So the individual that leaves the fold of Islam and examples like that. So everybody, his Dam is Ma'soom up until there is something that removes that isma, that protection from them. It's also, the people of knowledge also define individuals. Sometimes people can look at that hadith as Muslims alone, and so they clarify and they say it refers to 4 categories of people. The first is the Muslim, the second is the dhimmi, the third is the mu'ahad, the fourth is the musta'man. So what are these 4 categories? You have the Muslim, you know what Muslim is, we're all Muslims, alhamdulillah. A dhimmi is the one that lives under the Muslim rule. He lives under a Muslim country and he pays the jizya. Mu'ahad is the one that has an agreement, a sulh, for example, with the Muslims. There's a peace treaty between them. And a musta'man is somebody that, an individual that entered into a Muslim land seeking, protection so that he can get something done. So he's not living there, he's just traveling in and he's been assured protection. These 4 categories, it becomes haram to attack them. Who is not ma'soom? It's the harbi. the individual that Muslims are at war with. And so that individual, he's not protected, or his blood and wealth is not sanctified by Muslim law or Islamic law. His name is al-Harbi, meaning that between us and him is a harb, no, a war.
Treaty or war?
War, yeah. Harb, war. This individual is not protected. This individual is not protected. And so he does not have hurma. The Prophet ﷺ spoke time and time again regarding the individual that kills any of these three. The hadith comes regarding that the individual that he is from these categories of al-Manẓūmat, nafs al-Manẓūma, then lam yajid ra'ihat al-Jannah. Forget about entering Jannah. He's not going to smell the fragrance of paradise. So this is a very serious issue. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, establishes a principle here, which is what? That the essence of, or the default position of taking life from these four categories, with the exception of the harbi, is that it's not allowed. You can't just go around killing a random Muslim living in a non-Muslim land, or non-Muslim living in a Muslim land, or a Muslim in general. You have to have clear-cut proofs over why he's being, or his life is being taken. And so this is al-aslu fi al-nafs al-ma'soom, or if you want to call it al-aslu fi dam al-ma'soom, to spill blood from somebody that is protected, then that is haram. Again, حَتَّى يَجِيءَ الْحِلُّ. The author then says, وَالنَّفْسُ وَالْأَمْوَالِ وَالنَّفْسِ وَالْأَمْوَالِ. His wealth is exactly like him as well. And so the wealth of this individual is exactly like him as well. His wealth cannot be taken without due right. And so his wealth is also sanctified. So you taking his wealth is what? Is haram. Again, up until the permissibility is established.
Could be the okay.
The next two, let's just finish it off because there's multiple ways of looking at that, and then we'll stop. And Tanweer is really annoyed at us, but we just can take the last two lines, inshallah. Allah of Futiha. Number 22 and number 23. 22, he says, وَالْأَصْلُ فِي عَادَاتِنَا الْإِبَاحَةِ. That the asl of our norms and cultures is that it's permissible. What does he mean by this? We're going to talk about it again, inshallah ta'ala, in tomorrow's lesson when we get to al-'adat al-muhakkama. But it overlaps with this qa'idah of al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shakk as well, which is what is the default position of al-'adah. Al-'adah is the norms and the customs that exist. So if the people have normalized a certain practice, for example, the color of the clothing that you wear during winter, that you wear, مثلا woolly clothing, and maybe not a white thobe like I'm wearing, you wear that in the winter, for example. This is all what? Mubah. This is permissible. This is culture. This is customs. This is traditions. There's nothing wrong with that. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, says, وَالْأَصْلُ فِي عَادَاتِنَا الْإِبَاحَةِ. That the essence of our cultural norms is that it's permissible. حَتَّى يَجِيءَ صَارِفُ الْإِبَاحَةِ. Up until something comes that removes that permissibility from it. Like, for example, that this is connected to something based on aqeedah, for example. Right? That is a cultural practice that has theological roots. They say, don't do that. There's a practice that is prevalent, for example, that is associated with some sort of munkar that the Sharia states that we shouldn't be doing. For example, it's a norm of, might be in some cultures, to attend mixed weddings. Is that allowed? It's not allowed. So just because it's culture, you do not give precedence to it. Because now it opposes the Sharia of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. الْأَصْلُ فِي عَادَاتِنَا الْإِبَاحَةِ. And again, حَتَّى يَجِيءَ صَارِفُ الْإِبَاحَةِ. Up until that which removes that permissibility is found. The last one is وَلَيْسَ مَشْرُوعًا مِنَ الْأُمُورِ غَيْرَ الَّذِي فِي شَرْعِنَا مَذْكُورٌ أو غَيْرُ الَّذِي فِي شَرْعِنَا مَذْكُورٌ. وَلَيْسَ مَشْرُوعًا مِنَ الْأُمُورِ. That nothing is مشروع, meaning legislated. يعني يشرع لعباده من الأمور, from things غَيْرُ الَّذِي فِي شَرْعِنَا مَذْكُورٌ, besides that which is mentioned in our Sharia. Here the first thing that you have to identify is al-umur. What does he mean by al-umur here?
Ibadah.
Ibadat. Underline the ahsant. Ibadat. What is this principle otherwise known as? أحسنت. الأصل في العبادات التوقيف. الأصل في العبادات التوقيف. The default position and the basis of all acts of worship is التوقيف, meaning المنع, that you are prevented from doing that. Up until what? Up until a proof is established that this action is permissible for you to do. So the people of knowledge phrase it differently. Some say al-aslu fil ibadati al-tawqif. Others say al-aslu fil ibadati al-hadr. It's haram for you to do an act of worship up until Shab Barat. Do you know the ruling of praying 1,000 rak'ah on the 15th night? We don't know the proof. What is the ruling of it? It remains haram up until a proof is established to do such a practice. Does that make sense? So all of that is impermissible. These principles, the two rulings that are associated with an act of worship, we said tawqif and we said al-hadr. And with this we'll end. This will be last point, inshallah ta'ala. This principle is in reality two principles. So in this last line you can actually have two principles. Now the line where he says وَلَيْسَ مَشْرُوعًا مِنَ الْأُمُورِ غَيْرُ الَّذِي فِي شَرْعِنَا مَذْكُورٍ, that nothing is legislated from things except for that which comes in our sharia. He's trying to prove two things, not one thing. The first thing he's trying to prove is that once you hear of an act of worship that you do not know the evidence of, do you automatically say haram? What do? Somebody's praying duha and you didn't know what the ruling of duha was. You search for evidence, but at that moment in time, what do?
You can pray.
Huh?
You don't pray.
You will stop.
You stop. So you stop. So that is where the tawqif kicks in. So this is where it applies to you individually. And that's the first principle that he's trying to establish. That this is why the scholars use the term tawqifiyyah, which is you don't do it. You don't go around telling other people to, because that might be as a result of your ignorance. So you simply stop. That's one principle. The second principle is in the context of all of the people. Nobody knows a proof of this.
Nobody's ready.
No, we don't know a single proof of this. We've been debating this issue for years. هذا مولد النبي. ما حكمه بالدليل. Tell us a proof that allows this practice. Here you would say haram. Because it becomes concrete by us collectively not knowing that there's evidence behind an action. It becomes what? Haram. So there's two rulings here that he's trying to establish. The first is tawqif. When does that come about?
When you are not sure.
When you are unsure. You don't do anything you're unsure about. The second is it becomes haram. When is that?
We do not have any proof. Sure.
When collectively we cannot find it. There's no proof of this for certain scholars of search. There's nothing. There you say it becomes haram. And so there's two i'tibarat, there's two aspects to look at it from. And both of them are important for us to recognize. And with that we'll stop inshallah ta'ala, and with that we're still on schedule, but I felt I had to go to the end, Allah musta'an, because tomorrow's lessons could be even more intense. So may Allah make it easy. But Allah musta'an, we got through what we need to. هذا والله أعلم صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.